Honestly, I've been kind of pumping bidding for about 2 years, personally, and we're just sort of getting to a tipping point where we can see about 50% of revenue coming from networks that are participating in bidding.
How can you maximize ad revenue from your app? Welcome to Mobile Heroes Uncensored. My name is Koetsier. My co-host is Peggy and Salz, and this is an Origin Stories episode where we go in depth, one-on-one with mobile marketing experts. Our question today: in an age of privacy and as a ton of mobile ad tech is changing very rapidly indeed, how do you set yourself up for maximum revenue from ads? Peggy, who's our guest?
Well, John, we have Brian Truman, VP of Ad Revenue and Product at GSN Games, recently acquired by Scopely. Brian is, as I said, at GSN Games, but before digital marketing, where he's also working in monetization, he dabbled in the movie industry. And
Ooh.
thanks, yeah, and I think you can tell by the models,
A little bit.
a little bit, indeed. Landed a job in a gaming ad network, thanks to his proficiency in Excel keyboard shortcuts. Well, I think we have to go through those. Kind of
Yes.
intrigued. Absolutely. He has a decade of experience in digital advertising, and he's been entrusted with escalating responsibility and leadership roles as company. And he finds satisfaction in mentoring others and sharing with us, Brian. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. We got to find out more. What is this Excel shortcuts thing? There's got to be a
Yeah.
story here.
Yeah.
Yeah, there certainly is. So when I was sort of decided to leave the film and television industry, and I knew that I wanted to go into some part of the digital content business, I was a little unsure exactly what that was going to be. But I went into an interview with a company called CPM Star. They were a startup ad tech network, eventually acquired by GSN Games. The founder of that business, as part of the interview process, actually did an Excel test. The reason an Excel test was actually important is because as this like bootstrap startup, they actually built a lot of their systems around these massive, complicated Excel sheets. And so he's like, you got to know Excel. He puts me in front of a computer, asks me to do all sorts of like formulas, pivot tables, etc., showing my proficiency. And just as I had learned before through various other jobs and experience, not using a mouse and just doing it all on keyboard, doing keyboard shortcuts, doing it pretty quickly. He was impressed, and that's what landed me the job. But I otherwise had zero experience that was required for
That is awesome.
I
It
love it.
reminds me of being in an audio studio and so you see the audio engineers and they're just tapping and they're dancing. I mean, the keyboard is their instrument, right? And it's like when you're watching an expert do something, there's something magical about that. So that's how you got your start in mobile ad monetization. It's interesting. GSN Games sounds like it was really on the forefront. I mean, imagine that, a gaming company acquiring an ad network. I mean,
yeah, that was about 10 years ago or more,
Mm.
actually. And we're seeing that a lot happening now. And you're right. I think at least the idea then, and this was really pre-mobile, they did this to promote Facebook games, which were really hot at the time. And unfortunately, that business got replaced by mobile very quickly. And we just could not make the pivot fast enough. But very common to see today game publishers, buying ad tech companies.
And another big story out there is, of course, what's happening. Major changes in in-app ad monetization right now. Privacy, just one word. In-app bidding, and hey, with some recent changes, maybe even that will be gone. Give us a little bit of your view on that. Let's start with privacy, right? Challenges. What challenges does something like Apple's ATT add to monetization?
Sure. Look, it's been a big challenge over the last year, and even prior to that, as we look back to CCPA and GDPR, and we have both government regulatory challenges that come about, and I'm sure that there'll be even more of those. We're continuing to see legislation being introduced, but then we have the platform policy changes as well, things that Apple introduced last year, and things that will certainly come forward from Google as well. But I'm sure that you've had a lot of marketers on the show and people talk about the challenges that they've faced, as these changes. Ad monetization is really the other side of that, right? Like if marketers are being challenged, if marketers are having a hard time measuring their success or targeting their users, there's definitely going to have a downstream impact on ad monetization. And so the challenge has been, how do we ask our users for permission for data sharing, right? Because there can be some perhaps capture value if we can get that IDFA using the ATT prompt from Apple. So that was a big part of what we went through last year. Segmentation is becoming more and more important because we have some identifiers for some users and some for others, and there's a big disparity in terms of ad value that can be generated from those different users. So not only do you have different waterfalls, for example, for those users, but maybe they have different experiences, right? Because do you show more interstitials to a user who doesn't, or force ads who doesn't have an identifier and you're trying to generate more revenue, or do you show you less or fewer because they're just not generating as much money from those ad impressions? So there's a lot of things to think about. Do you have different caps on reward video because the impressions are worth less? But what we see is this disparity between users that have identifiers, whether you're on an Android or you actually do get the IDFA permission from a user on iOS, or those who don't. And how you treat those users is definitely something that has to go into consideration for every ad strategy.
And it's just going to get harder, right? Because some people get lots of IDFAs, and we've heard up to 60%. In fact, in one recent interview that Peggy and I did, most people are getting more like 20%. And since you need double opt-in on both apps, the advertiser and the publisher app, you're really low. Now we're seeing Google come out with its privacy sandbox. We're actually recording this on February 16th, and Google just announced that. It's going to be a 2-year process, but they're explicitly saying that they're building an identifier-free advertising world. So that complexity that you mentioned on iOS, some of that's going to come to Android as well.
Yeah, for sure. And it's brand new news. I don't want to comment. I haven't really processed it, but we sort of did expect that Google was going to do something, but hopefully in a way that is smarter, since obviously a big part of their business is around digital advertising. Apple did not necessarily have that particular conflict, but what we can probably expect, of course, is to just as Apple kind of found this way to make these changes and get a benefit for their own digital advertising service through Apple Search, is that Google can think about this also in a way and say, okay, look, what changes can we do to push this privacy issue, but also kind of build a larger moat, around our business and find an advantage for ourselves. So yeah, I think it
Such
also
a conspiracy theorist. I mean, like, really? Why would they do something like that?
I was just thinking the word moat, I haven't heard that, but when you think about it, it's like, whoa, is that what they're up to?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm very certain, here's my take, and I don't think I'm being too conspiratorial about it, but Apple very much had a very good reason to do so for marketing purposes alone, right? They can differentiate their platform from Google by pushing this privacy issue. Now, Google may feel pulled by that in order to try to just reach some sort of close level of parity in terms of marketing and not, sort of lose out to possible customers for the devices. But at the same time, I think Google's smart enough to not completely tank their advertising business.
And that's the key difference, right? I mean, Google is an ad network where Apple owns an ad network, right? So Google is doing this explicitly with the marketing and advertising community and trying to build ways to make sure there's attribution and measurement and targeting options and all those other things that we don't necessarily see to the same degree in SK Ad Network from Apple. That said, however, that's a whole big ball of wax, and we'll get into that, I'm sure, Peggy, over the next month or two, as this is a 2-year process that Google is going through. Maybe let's get back on track here, Brian, and just talk about, look, in this world of complexity, how do you counterbalance some of these things and still boost revenue? I mean, many apps rely heavily on in-app revenue from ads. Obviously you're going to do in-app purchases when you can, but ad revenue is huge. How do you boost that in this complex reality?
Sure. So I'll say, yeah, I've been sort of fortunate to work on apps that generate most of their revenue through IAP. So we have, a little bit different view, but definitely these apps out there I'm familiar with that are 100% dependent on ad revenue. And even some apps that I know, I've talked to, people in the industry who have their one major big app is only on iOS, right? So another advantage we had is maybe, more users on Android. And a lot of what we saw was that we actually increased our revenue because the spend and the benefit goes to Android, right? So if you were an Android developer and you were predominantly had users on Android, you might have actually seen increases just because that marketing spend shifted from one platform to the other. So that might have just happened and increased revenue based on your sort of audience and what devices they use. Another thing is because Facebook, obviously, I'll talk about Facebook because they've been in the news a lot recently. They've been highly dependent, of course, on their platform data, using audience network and reaching those users across different publishers, connecting the user identifier with their Facebook profile and doing pretty advanced targeting that really gave them a huge advantage, in monetization. And they were certainly a number one must-have partner when you're doing monetization in an app. That's not the case anymore. Networks are now behaving much more differently than they did 6 to 9 months ago. And now it's become much more important to actually have this diversity of ad sources or demand partners that you can use kind of smartly targeting, trying to capture as much of the different user segments that I've mentioned earlier to make sure that, some networks are better than others, right? So, brand advertisers, sometimes, as long as they're not doing, targeting, don't have the measuring challenges that marketers have for like user acquisition campaigns. So they just want to make sure they have, viewability, right? Using maybe IAB's open measurement or something like that. So some networks have a lot more of that brand demand. So now it's really about trying to get as many sources as possible coming in. Bidding is a part of this too, right? Getting as many people coming into the funnel, buyers, advertisers, when I say people, not players or users, in order to have access to that one ad impression, because there's such disparity between the values of the ad impressions now.
Great segue, because we're talking about massive change, Apple, Google, another wave of massive change, waterfall to in-app bidding. First of all, subtle differences, also different definitions. Walk us through the difference for you.
Sure. So a lot of this, what I'm talking about, can become moot, when we move into like full bidding platforms. Because right now we're trying to, as a monetization expert, like we're trying to manage all of these different types of users, whether we have identifiers, whether they're on iOS, whether they are a payer, a non-payer, right? Like there's all of these different segments advanced publishers are creating, which we'll maybe talk a little bit more about. But what that leads to is having all these multiple waterfalls and all these different demand sources and different positions in the waterfall based on network performance. Bidding can actually eliminate, the need for a lot of this work. So there's a huge operational effort that goes into monetization right now because of some of these challenges we're talking about. Bidding can be the solution in a lot of ways because it does the one thing that I'm trying to do is get as many networks as possible to see an ad request and get a fair bid against it. And so rather than like a traditional waterfall where you're like going out to one partner, another partner, another partner, another partner, until finally someone bids on it. And you may not be getting the best CPM for that particular impression. So, the bidding for me is really all about sort of improving the efficiency around the operations of ad monetization.
You talked about the opportunity there. You're going to get a fair price, maybe a better CPM than what we're seeing. What's the challenge for app publishers?
Honestly, I've been kind of pumping bidding for about 2 years personally, and we're just sort of getting to a tipping point where we can see about 50% of revenue coming from networks that are participating in bidding. But the challenge really has just been the testing and being patient for this technology to catch up with the promise. There's still a lot of networks and partners out there that are still trying to figure it out. even if they're supporting it, it's still important to test, because they still may not be doing as well as you may be able to do them within the waterfall. And so, there have been experiences where okay, let's try testing now. Let's go back to waterfall for the network because they're not quite there yet. And then they'll spend some time working on the technology. We'll test it again, right? And so that's really been the challenge, is like, when do you actually flip the switch? When is it working? And that's been the biggest challenge for us.
It's pretty funny because that's a huge challenge. That's a huge transition. And now, of course, we've got this Google thing where targeting is going to be in-app. Data is not going to flow out of the app to external sources if Google gets its way, if this does go forward. Privacy Sandbox is what I'm talking about. And how that operates, how that changes mediation, how that changes ad networks is going to be super, super interesting. All that's for the future. Here's what I want to ask. What's the one thing that you've done that makes that's made the biggest positive difference in performance and user experience?
The last year or two, I've seen really successful publishers doing is actually really thinking about a framework for evaluating new ad products, testing, which we'll talk about, and even testing old assumptions, not just new stuff, but like, because of all of these changes, because of user behavior changes throughout the pandemic, because of the increased number of buyers into the market, because of the privacy stuff, we really have been going back through our playbook and retesting everything. I think that's the most important thing that I see making a difference today, is probably retesting these sort of old assumptions. A lot of times we want to do a test, we're like, oh, that's positive, and we move forward and we roll it out to the users. And we did that 3 years ago, and now we just keep moving forward looking for new tests, right? Well, it's really become more important to go back and retest some of those old assumptions as well. That's what I would say is the biggest thing.
That's
Nice.
intriguing, John. Going forward by looking back and saying, it didn't work then, but maybe it does. I'd love to hear an example, because I'm trying to just get my head around this. What could it be from the past that we can do better now, or test differently, has different impact in the future? That's fascinating. Like what, Brian?
Sure. So, for example, different ad formats being used by publishers today. Common ones would be like a reward video, also perhaps like an interstitial, whether it's static or video. A big priority, I think, for publishers, game publishers particularly, is building these long-term relationships with the players. And there are several ways where we could have looked at a test in a short-term period, a long time ago, where ad revenue, by the way, CPMs were lower, and maybe disregarded it, right? So interstitials, for example, is that we would have tested interstitials, bringing them in at a certain point for a user, figuring out what cap is appropriate that does not have a substantial impact on our retention, right? Because these things work in conflict with each other, right? Like, we can add forced ads, but also we're going to increase or decrease retention. Well, that has an impact on our long-term relationship with our players. And so what is the right balance? Well, we've tested that before, and CPMs were lower, let's just say, or higher in the case of iOS. Like, the CPMs have gone all over the place from before. So when we're thinking about that trade-off of retention for ad revenue, what we decided 1 year ago or 2 years ago is certainly not the same thing that we're finding now today.
I love that, Peggy, because guess what? The world changes. The environment changes. People's familiarity with ads change. How they play games change. So looking at all that stuff makes a ton of sense to me.
Yeah, and the trade-off between the retention and the monetization, very, very different. And also what we'll tolerate, in lockdown. I know people are like, I'll just watch anything. I'll even watch ads. It's just anything to brighten up my jury day. So
yeah, and the behaviors, and some of them are, some of them we still think are new behaviors that aren't going away, but because of lockdown, because of COVID, game players specifically have developed a lot of new habits over the last year or 2 years. Some of them will maybe perhaps fade. Some of them are here to stay. And again, I think ad performance has been very different as well. I might reference this later, but last year specifically, based on some eMarketer reporting, the ad industry in the US, the spending of digital advertising revenue increased by 35%. It's astonishing. We've never had that big of an increase for several years. We typically, see 10, 15% a year. It jumped, I think they expected 14%, right? It jumped 35%. So with all of this new money coming into digital advertising, you can't assume that the CPMs and everything, are, and the new behaviors in combination, you can't assume the things that were tested 2 years ago are the same today.
So everything is changing. You obviously, you're hands-on here, and we love that opportunity, John, because we can talk about best practices, really surface some important points, dig a little deeper, right? Now, monetization professionals like yourselves, it's a new world. They need new skills, right? They need to maybe understand and segment their users better, other things. What's a good place to start?
Sure. So depending on the size of the publisher or the data that you have access to, this certainly could vary. But the one thing that probably most publishers will have access to is something like Google Firebase. If you can get this SDK integrated, it will give you a tremendous amount of opportunity to create events around advertising and to be able to track and monitor those events and to be able to do some data mining and surface some opportunities. The important thing here is to really, really learn about your users. What we're finding, I think, this would have been my second probably big unlock, right? Is that it's really important now to not treat every user the same, create new segments. And you can only know that, I can tell you about one particular game, but it's not going to be, really transferable, right? Because you have to really be able to learn about your own users. The data will tell you that we probably have a few different 3 to 5 different types of behaviors that you can group into different segments. And that I think is really, really important to sort of figure out when building an ad monetization strategy. And you will be able to do that using something like Google Firebase. I'll give you an example, right? I can look at the average number of impressions of, let's say, a particular format, let's say reward video. And, I can certainly create a goal and say, okay, I want to increase from 7 to 9. I'm making up these numbers, right? Per day, per user watching this many particular impressions. But that's not really a goal that you can really do and make changes around unless you know your player's behavior and what's going to drive it. Because with the data, if you dig in, is going to tell you is that you have 4 groups of players that one watches 0 ads, one will watch 1 ad, one group will watch 5 ads, and then another group will watch whatever maximum number you're going to allow them.
Yes.
So it could be 15. And you know what? If you want to increase the average revenue or average impressions per day, right, you can increase that cap to 20, and that group will watch 20. And then your overall average increases. But is that the best thing for your ad strategy? It may not be. It may be trying to move the users who watch 0 to just watch 1, or the users who watch 1 to watch 5, right? So histograms, this is where I get in a little bit statistical heavy, right? Is a particular sort of view of data that I use a lot personally, so that you can see this distribution, and that will really sort of bring to light some of these types of insights.
That's super smart. I absolutely love that. And we have a question for you that I actually have some personal recent experience with. We wanted to ask you about ad crashes. And I was recently in my favorite game and I died. And there was a chance with a rewarded video to watch the video and to resurrect magically and continue playing my game. And guess what? The ad just froze. It was unplayable, actually. And it was just I was trying to move the crops over to plant so that I could continue going, and nothing moved and it didn't change. And I had to force quit the app and lose all my progress. Talk to us about that scenario and what you can do to manage that.
Yeah, that's terrible. I'm sorry that happened.
It wasn't in your game.
Well, yeah, I'm just in general, ad crashes and ad quality in general has been one of the things that sort of haunt us, and it never seems to get any better, right? Maybe it even gets worse, right? But it's always the number one thing whenever you talk to any ad publisher, anyone who does this, who's dealing with ads in a game, it's the number one thing that they always wish I had a better way to deal with this. And there have been many attempts, but because all the networks and demand sources are so decentralized, and there's so many different formats and creative types, there's no standardization really across. It's really, really difficult problem to solve. So here's what we can do, right? So, by the way, I should one more thing is like, any game team or studio or app that begins to see an increase in spikes, then they have ads in the game, they immediately assume it's always ads. And usually they're going to be right, but it's like, it's so bad, they always assume it's ads. And I get these messages and say like, okay, we got crashes. It's probably you. Will you look at it? So crashes come across, my desk a lot. And so I'll talk about one of the really, really important skills and other, people can learn is using some sort of like web proxy debugger. We use Charles, we use others, but using something like this will allow you, if you can reproduce the crash, you can capture and log that internet traffic data and go back to the source and let them know, hey, here's the ad, here's the data I have on it, it's causing a crash if it's a specific ad, and they can resolve it. So that's one thing that you can do. It's usually pretty labor intensive, and having some really great QA sources on your team to be able to do this, really, really helpful. But you also want to create some sort of monitoring system. Maybe you're using, Crashlytics or something that you can actually monitor on a regular basis and try to get out in front of some of this stuff. I wish there was a better solution. Obviously, it is always going to be the number one thing for publishers to complain about. But the last thing I could probably think about is just choosing partners that you have trust and stability and that are constantly putting out really high-end, high quality like SDK updates and not bug-filled SDK updates. And so what you'll find is as you work with different partners, there are some that are better than others, but you have to be sort of selective of who you work with and building that relationship with, those third-party vendors is certainly, an important part of it.
Cool.
I like this. We're learning, the holistic approach here, the different types of skills, look for what is crashing. You've obviously had a few marketing nightmares in your life, Brian, is what it sounds like to me. So you've been there, done that. You are definitely seasoned. What do you know now today that if you could tell your younger self?
So I've worked, at the network. I've worked at a publisher. I've worked always pretty much on the monetization side. I've never really worked directly on the marketer side, like many of your guests, have all this tremendous marketing experience and user acquisition and things like that. And I really wish I probably would have done more, or I would have learned more about it earlier. Now I get actually a lot more exposure to it. But early on, I just didn't.
But you knew the keyword, the keyboard shortcuts. So that's
I did know that. I knew Excel. I just never had to run a Facebook campaign before. So, the idea, and it's really interesting now, and this is why I'm interested in it, because all of these measurement techniques and the challenges introduced by privacy changes and other things are shifting. But what I've learned is, as a ad monetization expert even, is I really have to think about what the marketer wants, right? Like, yes, we think about what our players, their experience is like, but if I'm trying to differentiate what is ultimately a commodity, right? Ad impressions across the digital ecosystem are commoditized essentially. If I'm trying to differentiate that, like, I really, really have to know what the marketer is looking for, how they're going to measure it, how they're targeting for it, what they're looking for in terms of ad quality, right? That helps me sort of provide some viewpoint around our ad strategy, around where is the best place to put an ad, right? For example, you John, you mentioned you were watching that ad as you were, trying to, sort of get a new life, after dying, right? Well, even if it didn't crash, what's the likelihood that you would have engaged in that ad when you really just want to get back to the game, right? Like, that's not, in my opinion, a really high quality advertising placement for that marketer. Like, the marketer doesn't want someone who's just trying to get an ad view and then go back to their game. They want you to engage with the ad. For example, an interstitial ad, even, like, is it better to show it in the very first minute after someone's opened the app, or do you want to show it maybe toward the end of their session, 10 minutes in, because they're more likely to engage with that ad at that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we hear about your experience. Quick, one word, one sentence advice. What's the biggest or most common mistake you see others making in mobile monetization? What's your advice to solve that?
So I'm trying to fit two things, and I'll make them brief. But one is they do a lot of testing, and I think a lot of testing, we hear about testing a lot, testing. But thinking about like a framework around testing and what you're really trying to accomplish, I kind of referenced some of these things earlier, I think sometimes can be misguided. And also just not enough time and understanding statistical significance and confidence and things like that, right? So I always hear these durations of like, oh, we need to run this test for 1 week. Well, that doesn't mean anything depending on how much revenue or impressions you're getting, right? If it's a small number, like we need to run it for a longer period of time, right? And there's this idea that it's duration time-based as opposed to volume-based when you do testing. So that's one thing that I often see being a mistake. And networks, for example, can do all sorts of things to fluctuate in tests, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a little tip because I used to run, an ad network, is that whenever we want somebody, a publisher, to test something new, we have toggles, that we can, like on our control board, give them a boost in revenue share. It's going to make the test look really great. And then once they're committed to that change, we're just going to dial it back down, right? So, so long-term testing is like really, really, really important in my opinion. Like we run tests. I don't try to do daily or weekly tests that like are going to pump revenue for a short period of time. I focus on tests that are going to have long-term impact that I run for 3 months, sometimes with a holdback route for 6 months for a percentage of users. So yeah, I'll kind of leave it at that, but that's what I think thinking about the way you do testing is really important.
Mm-hmm.
I really love that because if you really dig into testing, and let me tell you, we interview a lot of mobile marketers, and test is always the easy answer, right? Yeah, test it. Well, if you really dig into it and you look at the numbers, so many tests don't meet the standards for statistical reliability. They just don't. And so you're cloaking kind of what you want to do in terms of, well, that's what the data says, or you're kind of just surrendering your power as a marketer to, you know what, I think this will work and I'm going to go for it, and just saying, oh, what will the data show? So that's a great tip. Now we want to end here. We always ask for 3 tips from our guests. What are your top 3 tips to maximize mobile ad monetization without distracting from the experience and just losing all your users?
Sure. So look, as someone who's worked predominantly on apps that are IAP driven and balancing ad revenue and retention, with that goal in mind, reward videos, obviously a value exchange that a lot of users like, that we find a lot of value in increasing retention and doing it in a way that does not, cannibalize, IAP either. And so I personally spend a lot of time thinking about new ways that the reward video can be incorporated into, it doesn't even have to be a game, I think, in all kinds of, applications. And so, and users tell us that that's something that they really actually quite appreciate. And it's not distracting as long as it doesn't crash. So crashes would be the other thing, right? Which is like, being able to come up with some way that you can either monitor and then ultimately sort of deal with those quickly, or even just avoid them altogether. I think crashes is something that frankly I see a lot of publishers don't even deal with, right? I think there's just so many of them that they don't even have a good way to know if it's happening, right? They wouldn't even know this is happening because they're not watching for this. And ads certainly do carry that risk. And so I suppose that would probably be number 2 in terms of just creating a distracting experience, is making sure you have a good way to deal with that. And this is a complaint we see a lot, is just seeing the same ad over and over again. Now, most people will tell you, well, that's fine because that's spending a lot of money and that's just generating a lot more money. And that may or may not be the case, but as far as like creating a distracting experience, it's interesting what a diverse group of ads will do for a person. I think we've all done this, even if you're watching Hulu or television. If you see the same ad over and over, like you really start to notice that ad, and not in a good way.
Mm.
And so diverse demand, lots of demand sources, but also maybe even putting caps on those networks so they don't necessarily have access to show that same big buyer over and over again.
Smart.
Yeah.
I start to hate brands when I see their ad too much, so not a good plan.
Well, this has been an amazing show, John. I mean, we have good shows, but to go into so much depth, so much detail, come away with so many learnings that you're saying, like, yeah, Monday morning, I'm going to do that. I'm going to start to monitor if something crashes. Isn't that a novel idea? I really thought this is one of our shows, John. It's one to bookmark. That's what it is.
I think
It's
that's
a keeper.
absolutely true. I
It's a
think that's
keeper.
absolutely true. Brian, great job, great insights. Really do appreciate your time. Also love your background. I gotta admit that. Is that a X-wing or is it a TIE fighter in the back? I don't know. It's some sort of spacecraft.
There's a TIE fighter.
Okay, yeah, there you go. Yeah,
Too
X-wing,
cool.
obviously not an X. So there we go. TIE fighter would be the solution. Brian, thank you so much for your time. It has been a lot of fun listening to you expound on both sides of ads, buying them, selling them, monetizing with them, all that stuff. For everybody else who's watching, hey, if you want to be on the show, let us know. If you're a mobile expert and you've got great insights like Brian, or maybe even just have as much as Brian, we'd like to chat with you and enjoy the show.